When was the last time you helped someone while you yourself were in need? Before the sun rose that morning, before the road warmed and the birds began to argue over who would sing first, Dona Lindaura was already awake. Her house sat on the edge of a small cluster of homes, a handful of clay walls with hairline cracks, a battered tin roof that sang when the wind found the right seam. Morning light had not yet touched the horizon. The room smelled of earth, of dried cornmeal, and of the faint sweetness of the slab of jaggery wrapped in oilcloth on a wooden shelf. She moved quietly, not to wake the ghosts of habits that filled the house. Damiao's old cap hung by the door where he always left it, a faded photograph tucked into a dent in the wall, 3 mismatched plates stacked in the sink. The kettle was cold and the cistern low. Her pantry held a handful of manioc flour, enough perhaps for a thin porridge, and the jaggery, the hard dark sugar that chipped like old wood when you tried to bite it. She lifted the jaggery near her face, inhaled the faint molasses scent, and felt the old steady ache in her chest that did not leave even after prayer. She knelt by the small wooden stool, where she kept a worn cloth and a little tin dish for coins that had not been used in years. She prayed without theatrics, one sentence at a time, the way breath and memory do, gratitude for another day, a brief petition for those who still had need, a remembering of Damiao. Her voice was the sort of voice that had learned to speak softly to God, because the world often interrupted loud prayers with the noise of necessity. The road creaked awake. Dust stirred, a rooster called somewhere beyond the next field, and in the dim distance a figure appeared, walking slow and steady, his silhouette folded with the morning. He was a man of ordinary size, ordinary clothes, but everything about him was edged in dust, as if the road itself had rubbed its thumb across his shoulders. What stood out most were his eyes, quiet, patient, as if he were listening to something the rest of the world could not hear. He stopped at her gate, shaded his face from a sun that had not yet risen, and offered a greeting that sounded like a cairn dropped softly into water. "Peace to you, ma'am." Lindaura pocketed her prayer and watched him with the small suspicion people have. When strangers cross a boundary, they never open for joy. The neighborhood had been generous in its time, but those days were small and fewer now. Children left for distant towns and did not look back often. Damiao's death had closed a chapter that never fully mended. Yet, when the man asked for a little water and a place to rest for a moment's shade, something in Lindaura warmed. It was a simple request, the sort you could answer without expense. She stepped to the door and called, "Come in. Sit by the stove." The man accepted the invitation as if it were expected courtesy. His boots left faint grey marks on her floor. She handed him a gourd cup she saved for visitors and poured water from the cracked clay jar. He drank with grateful, careful sips, and when he returned the gourd, there was a small, honest smile, one that did not ask for thanks, only offered it. After the water, she cut a thin cake of manioc flatbread from the little flour she had, cooked it on the iron skillet until the edges browned, and broke the jaggery into 2 with a careful tap of her knife. Sharing the jaggery was like sharing a treasure in that house. They split it and each took a small piece. The man ate slowly, as if tasting not only the sweetness but also the gesture that made it possible. He wiped his fingers on the hem of his shirt and said, "Some people are being prepared, Mom. You do this not because you have much, but because the heart is generous." Instead of answering that declaration outright, Lindaura offered a laugh that was half surprise and half choked skepticism. "I have nothing to offer," she said plainly, the truth of the line like something she repeated to herself for many mornings. "But I can help." That sentence, humble, stubborn, hung between them in the shaded kitchen. It was not an invocation. It was a fact stated in the small, clear voice of someone who knew the arithmetic of need. The man nodded, as if he had expected just such words. He placed his palm lightly over his heart and said, "Then you have given more than you know. If you are listening, pause for a moment and picture that house. the cracked walls that kept out neither dust nor memory, the single window where the morning wind foraged through, the worn chair that had held Damiao for years. Picture an old woman who counts what she has and still opens the door. It is not a story about riches exchanged. It is a story about what happens when the poor set their table and hold it open. If this story is speaking to you, subscribe for more stories like this that feed the soul. She had been called many things over the years by those who left or who stayed. Stubborn, kind, a fool for giving away what could have been kept. She had been a mother and a widow. She had been forgiven and bitter in impulse. She had lived through harvest failures that made the flour scant, and through winters when the cistern offered only a whisper of water. The children, Marcelo, Julia, Rodrigo, had one by one left seeking work, making their slow way to towns where the money was supposed to talk to hunger. Calls were rare, visits rarer still. Some letters came, folded into envelopes that smelled faintly of smoke and machine oil. At night, she would set the letters under her pillow like soft, brittle promises. In the morning light, when the man sat with his feet close to the hearth and talked in small, patient sentences, she would recall Damiao's hands, broad, calloused, the kind that knew the smell of soil and how to hold a plough steady. She remembered the day the fever took him away, an ordinary afternoon that stepped over the edge into loss. Her grief had been quiet, not loud, folded into the pressing chores of life. Loneliness had become not an interruption, but a current she learned to navigate. The man listened to these memories without pressing, as if memory itself was a kind of sacrament and he did not wish to profane it. When a whisper of wind stole the oilcloth wrapper from the jaggery and made a little paper sail across the table, he caught it and folded it straight. He spoke then about tests, not as condemnation, but as invitations. God watches the way we keep our doors, he said, not because God needs food, but because the way we open our hands reveals the way our heart is made. Lindaura chewed the last piece of jaggery and let the bitterness of the sweet linger. She had heard sermons, heard neighbors preach kindness as a duty. She had said, in the privacy of her own room, that she would not be tested by miracles she could not afford. But when the first visitor came that day, a man with dust like a cloak slung upon his shoulders, the real tests began. The truck driver arrived at the edge of her dirt yard with a flat tire and frustration like thunder in his voice. He had a rig loaded with blankets and sacks that needed to reach a town beyond the valley. He asked, embarrassed, if there was any way to borrow a spare. Lindaura's spare was an old tire, kept more for sentiment than for use, its rubber cracking, its band thin from years of sitting. She looked at the trucker's face, worn, with an anxious twitch, then at the tire leaning against the fence. She could have said no. Instead, she took the tire down from the fence and led him to the shed where rusted tools slept. She and the trucker fought the lug nuts they needed and prayed quietly when the jack slipped. He offered money, more than she had expected to receive for a favor, and she refused it with a stubbornness that made him quieter still. He insisted, and she refused again. Finally, he folded his hands and said, "Remember this, Mom. I'll come back." He climbed into his rig with a look that could not entirely hide a new softness and drove away, leaving a faint groove in the dirt where his wheels had turned. A little later, a woman came trotting down the lane, her hair wrapped in a cloth, the color drained from her face. In her arms, a child convulsed with fever. She asked only for herbs to make tea, something to cool the fever, and a place to sit until a neighbor could fetch the clinic's small medicine box. Lindaura brought out a sack where she kept dried mint, feverfew, and a root whose name she had learned from Damiao years before. She boiled water, crushed leaves with her fingers, and fed the bitter infusion to the child. The child's breathing eased, then slowed, and the mother wept and called Lindaura an angel in the harsh way people use heaven to name miracles. The man with the quiet eyes watched all of it, sometimes standing at the doorway, sometimes sitting by the hearth, his presence like a steady rhythm in the house. He murmured brief words that were more murmurs than declarations, words of blessing, of quiet encouragement. "You did the right thing," he said to Lindaura after the child slept. "You did not look for a ledger. You only looked for the person." By the time dusk leaned its head over the field, a young man, skin glistening with sweat and fear, stumbled into the yard. He smelled of sweat and the sour tang of recent running. He had been running from men who counted him as debt or trouble. His pockets were empty, and his eyes darted like a hunted bird. He asked for a place to hide until the road was safe. Lindaura did not interrogate him. She led him to the small loft where grains were sometimes kept, and set him down on a mat. She gave him a thick slice of bread and a cup of water, and covered him with an old blanket that still smelled faintly of Damien's tobacco. The young man kept his head down and talked sparingly when he talked at all. He blamed circumstance, blamed gossip, blamed the wrong choices he had made. Then, with a humility that had the ring of truth, asked forgiveness for anything he might have caused. Lindaura answered him with a bowl of soup and a warning about coastal towns, where promises were as easy as sand and cooled as quickly. The stranger with the patient eyes stooped and tucked the blanket around the young man, as if the motion of care could stitch frayed threads. One after another the needs arrived, as if the day had been a sieve and the world had shaken its pockets. A family fleeing a landlord's threats came with their children and no more than a sack of clothes. They asked quietly if there was any food they could buy. Lindaura handed over the rest of her manioc flour, and the neighbour across the way, a woman who owed her bread to Lindaura's kindness in years past, brought a tin of preserved beans from her back room. The trucker returned later that evening as he had promised, not only to offer thanks, but to bring a small crate of supplies he had been carrying. "You gave me a tire," he said. "You fixed more than my truck. You set a place in my mind for what matters." He handed her a jar of coffee, a luxury for a house that had nearly forgotten the smell. Each encounter left a mark on the day and on the house, a line of gratitude and debt that was not measured in money. People walked away with full bellies, warm blankets, and softened edges. They left promises, actual, practical promises, to return, to help mend a roof, to carry a pail of water on a dry day. The man with the peaceful eyes called each act a proof, not in the sense of a test to pass or fail, but as evidence of a life shaped by something deeper than fear or calculation. As the sun sank and the first stars came out like pins in a dark cloth, Marcelo's name arrived like a wind that had been blowing for some time. For months, Lindaura had tried not to make a calendar of her children's absences, but when the day arrived, when a shadow fell across the door and Marcelo stood on the threshold, everything slowed and the house swelled. He was taller than the photograph, hair gone a little thinner at the temples, hands hardened by work, eyes rimmed with the fatigue of a man who had learned how to survive. He opened his mouth to speak, and the words fell tangled at first, like a fisherman's line caught on a submerged branch. "Ma'am," he said, voice thick, I'm sorry I left. I had to find work. Things got hard." He looked not for forgiveness so much as for permission to belong again. Lindaura's hands moved as if of their own accord. She reached for his face and felt the stubble of a man, years older than the boy who had once run in the fields. They embraced with the kind of ceremony that does not need words. The strange man watched from his chair as if he had been expecting this too. For a moment, the house held breath and memory together like a pair of palms cupping light. The young man who hid from trouble and the trucker who had driven off with the gravel of the road on his tires both found themselves staying a while longer than planned. One by one, they helped carry a pail, scrub a plate, mend a torn blanket. It was the way communities heal, by the unglamorous work of hands and the soft apologies that stitch wounds the world does not see. Over and over that day, Lindaura repeated what she had said at the first cup of water. "I have nothing to offer, but I can help." It was a phrase that sounded like a confession and a vow at once. It was honest about her scarcity, honest about her choice. The man with the quiet eyes never pressed her to change. Instead, he reminded her gently that sometimes what looked like nothing in the hands was everything in the heart. He spoke once to the small gathering of helpers near the kitchen stove as they washed dishes and handed out plates. "There are moments when God's work seeks the smallest hands," he said. "It hides in the open door. That is how the world is mended, with the patient work of ordinary people doing what they can." The words were plain but not trite. They landed like cool water on dry palms. Late that evening, the stranger asked for nothing. He ate sparingly, thanked Lindaura, and rose to go as quietly as he had come. For an old woman used to the solitude, the thought of greeting yet another traveller might have been tiring. Instead, there was a steady calm in her chest. She walked him to the gate under a sky now crowded with stars, and standing there in the cool air that smelled like crushed grass and wood smoke, she felt for a moment that the day had been stitched to something larger. The stranger paused at the path and turned back. "Keep your door open," he said simply. "Keep your hands ready." He smiled in a way that felt less like a vouchsafe and more like a shared map to a place they both seemed to know. And then he walked away, his figure swallowed by the road's slow curve, leaving behind a house that buzzed with new life. Lamps were lit, cups were passed, and talk, soft, shamed and grateful, filled the air. That night, Lindaura lay awake longer than usual. The house was quiet but for distant breathing, and the occasional creak of settling wood. She thought about the young man who had hidden, about the family with empty hands, about the trucker who returned with gifts. She thought about how easy it would have been not to open the door, how many doors go closed each day because fear measures what little remains. She thought about Damiao's hands resting on her cheek in a memory that felt almost like blessing. The phrase she had said aloud to the stranger earlier returned to her like a refrain. "I have nothing to offer, but I can help." She folded that phrase over and over in her mind like someone folding a cloth, smoothing creases until the motion itself brought peace. She did not imagine riches. She did not expect miraculous overturning of her fortune. She imagined small things, a repaired bench, a neighbor bringing a jug of milk when it was needed, letters that turned into visits. She imagined children who came back to sit at her table and laugh like they had once done. These were not grand visions. They were the ordinary hopes of an ordinary heart. In the morning, the town hummed in a way it had not in months. Birds skittered. Someone pounded on a fence to call their dog. The cistern's water did not magically refill. The roofs were not suddenly replaced, but something had loosened in the neighborhood's memory, a softening, a recollection of where true wealth sits. People who had watched Lindaura from a distance began to speak her name and remember the times she had shared bread when she barely had bread to give. The trucker who had received a tire fixed his rig at a cost far less than he expected and came back with fresh coffee and a promise to return on dry days to fill her cistern. The mother with the feverish child returned to offer a small tin of sugar and an apology for not stopping earlier. The family who had been expelled from their land returned the following week with a crate of seedlings, small green promises of food and work. Word of the day's events began to travel up and down the valley, not as sensational news, but as the kind of slow rumor that changes how neighbors regard one another. People remembered that house on the edge because someone had opened the door and stayed open even when everything inside was scarce. When the afternoon sun softened to a lunch of golden light, Marcello lingered over stories about distant towns. He told of work that cost more than the wages gave, of friends who had left and not returned, of nights when he slept beneath a truck and dreamed of a table he had once known. He spoke sparingly about his regrets and more about the practical things he could do to help now. Carry water, repair a roof, plant a small garden of beans that would not demand much more than patience. Lindaura listened, her hands on a bowl of soup, the house filling with the sound of human things, forks, a simmering pot, the soft laughter that comes not from spectacle, but from presence. Outside, the man with patient eyes stood beneath the lane's lone tree, looking toward the road. He did not hurry. He seemed to be waiting for something that would not be hurried. The day after that, a neighbor came by with a bag of cornmeal, slipped it inside the doorway with the furtive respect of someone returning a debt they had long owed. A week later, a group of townspeople gathered to patch the roof. Some with nails and boards, others with hands that measured and lifted and fit wood to wood until the house no longer sang in the rain. Small repairs, one by one, became a kind of anthem. Not a trumpet, not a herald, but an everyday music of neighbors putting what they had into the life of one among them. In the midst of the mending, the man with the quiet eyes returned, as if the road itself had guided him back. He stood a little while at the gate, watching people work. He did not speak many words. His presence was enough. Lindaura, kneeling on a plank to reinforce a sagging beam, glanced up. For a long moment they regarded one another, as two people who kept a covenant with the ordinary. "You keep your hands ready," he said softly. "You have already shown what matters." She wiped her palms on her skirt, the motion as familiar as prayer. She had given what she could, and in giving had been returned to a community's memory. She had not received riches in the way the world keeps score. She had received something else. Neighbors arriving not out of obligation, but out of remembered affection. A son who spoke of staying, a house that no longer felt like it lived alone. That evening, as the last of the workers left and the sky leaned toward dark, a small group sat by the doorway sipping coffee and speaking of mundane things, who would fetch medicine, who would carry water tomorrow, when a quiet hush descended. The guest with patient eyes rose to go, and this time there was a different tension in the air. He had become, over the days, a presence under which memories and small mercies rearranged themselves. "You will be all right," he said to Lindaura, almost a promise. "Keep watch, keep the door open." He placed his hand lightly on Marcello's shoulder, then on the shoulder of the young man who had hidden, and then on the trucker's arm. Each touch was a benediction of ordinary things, courage to stay, strength to work, a steadiness to live with others. As he turned to go, there was a rustle at the edge of the yard, a shadow moving where the lane bent, and in that brief instant the world was still as if awaiting a bell to ring. People exchanged looks. Marcello straightened, the muscles in his jaw working. Lindaura's heart beat an old rhythm she understood without naming it. The stranger's steps were slow, then steady, and for reasons she could not explain, she felt an urgency to say something she had not yet said. "Who are you?" she called after him before the words were fully formed, and the sound of her voice on the word carried more than curiosity. It held the simple, ridiculous hope that names can sometimes be keys. He paused, as if hearing something distant, and replied in the kind of voice that does not invite spectacle, "I am only a traveller." Then he walked on, his figure shrinking into the road's curve, and the town exhaled. The next morning there were footprints at the gate that did not belong to anyone in the village. They were single, solitary prints that followed the path the stranger had taken, as if he were the origin of a new pattern. People came by to see, and then to remember the day the man had said simple words, and then simply left. The trucker brought a crate of preserved goods, and left it on her porch with an awkward bow. The mother with the feverish child came and hugged Lindaura until the old woman wept, and the young man who had been hiding came to the door to ask permission to marry the neighbor's daughter, a small, brazen hope that had found renewed life. Even so, there was a hush that settled in the house. It was a kind of waiting, part gratitude, part the human sense that some doors, once opened, expect other doors to open in response. Lindaura worked around the house in the way she had always worked, washing, preparing, sweeping the little yard, but her mind kept returning to the man who had sat with a cup and broken a small piece of sugar with her. Late in the afternoon, as a wind moved in from the fields and the sky took on a bruised purple, Marcello stepped outside and called his mother aside. He spoke in a low voice, the kind parents learn to use when children are asleep in the next room, so their dreams are not touched by adult troubles. "I want to stay," he said. "I can work the land. I owe you that." There was a tenderness to the words that was almost a prayer. Lindaura felt the years fall away in that instant, the distance between them narrowing like a road mended. She saw not the boy who had once spilled a jar of seeds in laughter, nor simply the man who had been pulled by the world's restless need, but someone returning to a place that had been held open for him. The sun slipped. The house settled into a soft dark. The road carried on as roads do, full of arrivals and departures, while in the small yard a family began to stitch itself anew. Hands that had once threaded through daily tasks now found new reasons to move. The neighbors who had brought boards and nails returned at odd hours with soup or a sack of grain, each gift like a pebble tossed into a still pond, rings widening. But the stranger with patient eyes did not return to stay. He walked on, leaving in his wake a thread of questions that would not rest. The people who had been helped whispered about him, about the soft certainty of his presence. They wondered whether the day had been ordinary grace or something beyond their naming. That was the place where the story pauses, the hinge of a day when ordinary kindness opened into a larger possibility. The house was fuller now, not because one person had gained wealth, but because hands had found each other and begun to work. The cistern was still not full, the roof still needed more boards, but a rhythm had begun. Late that night, when the village lights dimmed and only a few lamps burned like constant stars, Lindaura sat by the window and watched the road where the stranger had disappeared. She folded her hands, not to pray for a miracle, but to pray for courage, to keep the door open, and to give where giving could be done. Her prayer was simple and brief, offered to a God she had spoken with in the intimacy of many small mornings. "Lord," she said, "keep my hands ready, keep my heart open, let me be useful for what little I have left." She felt neither thunder nor a thunderous answer. She felt a gentle settling in her chest, the way a seed takes hold in soft soil. The words that had been said to her, about being prepared, about proofs, moved through her like a slow wind. At dawn the next day the house buzzed with a new kind of motion, the sound of tools, soft laughter, and the footfall of people who had decided to stay a while longer. Mending continued. Plans were whispered. Marcello spoke of starting a small patch of beans, planting not only for food, but to have a reason to look up when the rain came. And yet the road remained a question. The stranger's voice, his touch, his quiet benedictions, what did they point to? People began to ask whether such a man could be more than ordinary. Were his words simple wisdom or the echo of something holy? For some, the answer landed as a whisper. For others, it remained a rising curiosity that could not be easily named. The season turned, and the days piled up in their ordinary way. There were small harvests and small disappointments. There were times when dinner was thin, and times when bread was abundant. The neighbors' children learned to fetch water in a way that made the work lighter. The trucker came and went with loads and left, each trip leaving a small kindness behind. The family with the seedlings planted beans that leaned toward the sun. Marcello worked until his hands were strong and his laughter returned in pieces, and beneath all of it, like a slow current, there lived the memory of the man who had sat at the kitchen table and said patient things. Sometimes Lindaura would catch herself listening to the road, as if expecting a footstep that would finish a sentence left open. Sometimes the children would press their faces to the window and peer down the lane, hoping for a sight of the figure who had once paused and blessed them with touch. There were stories being told, small and honest. The trucker, who had once been a stranger himself, told anyone who would listen about the woman who had given him a socket and a cup of coffee and made him remember what mattered. The mother with the feverish child swore she would repay a kindness with a life. The young man who had been hiding found work and slowly learned not to run from his past, but to face it. Each testimony was a thread that tied the community to the place where kindness had been offered, but questions remained. Who was the traveler? Why had he come to that particular doorway? Had he been merely a tired passerby or something more? People debated with the gentle curiosity of communities that measure meaning in gestures, not headlines. The answers were not uniform. Some said he was a prophet, others a good man, and a few suggested more carefully that he might have been an instrument of grace in no ordinary disguise. Lindaura continued to sweep her doorstep and mend her life the way she mended a hem, stitch by stitch, prayer by prayer. She kept the door open. She kept the jaggery wrapped in oilcloth, now a treasure that had been a turning point in a day's story. She fed the neighbors when they needed to be fed, and she taught a small child how to stir porridge slowly so that it did not clump. She learned to listen to the way a person speaks and find in that voice whether they were hungry for food or for being seen. Then, on a late afternoon when the sky was a sheet of pale brass and the shadows stretched long, a messenger arrived, breathless, with news that a man from another valley said he had seen a figure on the road carrying a staff and stopping to help travelers, that this man had been seen feeding the hungry and speaking quietly to those in pain. The messenger's eyes were wide with the wonder of a rumor becoming possible. People leaned in to hear more. The news traveled like ripples spreading from a dropped pebble. It was in that charged moment, with the house alive from the day's mending and with the scent of coffee drifting from the stove, that something more solemn than gratitude took root in Lindaura's chest. She had done what she could. She had kept the door open, and in return life had returned to her home. The road had given her a gift she could not name wholly, and yet it had also set into motion a current of need that would test the edges of her generosity again. She did not yet know what the next days would demand. She only knew that the small ledger of her life, what little she had to give and what more she had to offer of herself, had been balanced by a series of ordinary kindnesses that had, together, begun to change the neighborhood's story. Hands had been joined, walls had been mended, a son had returned. The question that remained like a soft knock at the back door was this: would she keep the door open when the cost rose again? The answer would not come easy. It would demand small sacrifices and large courage. It would ask her to trust that the posture of hospitality was not mere sentiment, but a way to live under the sky, a covenant with the neighbor, with the road, with whatever mystery walks incognito along the way. As dusk folded into night, Lindaura rose from her chair and stood at the doorway looking down the lane where the stranger had once walked. Her hands were calloused in the honest way of work, the lines of her face lit by the low lamp, and her eyes had the steady patience of someone who had learned that hope is not a burst of light, but a slow pushing toward morning. Some doors, she thought, must stay open even when you have very little to place upon the table. Some invitations cost more than money and return more than goods. She could not yet name the shape of the gifts that had come. She only knew the posture she had taken. Open hands, open hearth, was a posture God noticed in some way she did not claim to fully understand. And so the house settled for the night, its repairs still fresh, the cistern a small uncertain promise, the community's new rhythm like a song in the key of ordinary life. Outside the road curved on into shadow, and somewhere beyond the hill a traveller walked, his footprints fading beneath the sky. The story had moved far from a single morning cup of water. It had become a small movement of lives, intersecting. It had given back dignity to hands that had been taught to hide. It had called a son to return, and it had opened a town to remember that charity is rarely a one-way street, but a circle that includes giver and receiver, neighbor and traveler. Yet beneath these quiet triumphs lay a deeper question that had not been answered, one that pressed like rain on the roof. Who exactly had Lindaura been talking to that morning when she split her last piece of jaggery and said, "I have nothing to offer, but I can help"? The answer would come in time, but not yet. For now the road kept its secret, and the house on the edge of the village kept its light burning, an invitation to neighbors, to the poor, to anyone who needed a small shelter and a portion of kindness. The work of hospitality had begun, and it would ask more of them than they could have predicted. Days turned into weeks, and the small house on the edge of the lane became less a place of mere shelter than a hinge where lives shifted. The rhythm that had begun with a single cup of water gathered momentum. People came to borrow a tool or a bowl and left with more than material things. They left with attention given and dignity returned, and in that exchange the town remembered how neighborliness once held them together. Word traveled beyond the valley like a song carried by wind. A man from a nearby market stopped to tell of seeing the stranger further down the road, handing a loaf to a woman who had stumbled with a baby on her hip. A woman on a cart described the traveler sitting on the edge of a bridge, tying the shoe of a child whose family had no money for new boots. The story multiplied not as gossip, but as a trail. Here was a person who paused, blessed, and kept moving. The trucker came by more than once. Over a chipped mug of coffee, he spoke softly about how something had changed in him since the first morning he had driven off from Lindaura's yard. "I used to think I had to hold tight to every coin," he said, stirring the coffee with the stub of a spoon. "But that day when I sat on that tire and you gave it up like it was nothing, I couldn't sleep for thinking about how small or large our store of mercy actually is. I began to give rides, to carry an extra sack, to stop at small crossroads. Folks notice. My routes are the same, but my days feel different." He set the cup down and looked at Lindaura as if trying to measure what to call this different thing. "I can't explain fully. I just know I started to remember faces." The mother who had come with the feverish child returned clutching a small parcel to the kitchen table. She sat and smoothed the oilcloth wrapper where the jaggery had once been kept. "Your tea saved my son's breath," she said. "I had no one to teach me how to make it, but your hand showed me what to do. I tell people that night was the first time I felt someone look at me like I was not a trouble, but a person." Her fingers trembled not from cold, but from the rush of remembering grace. The young man who had hidden in the loft came out into the light of day with a hat in his hands and a steadier voice. He found work with a farmer who needed help moving produce, and the farmer, hearing how the young man had been sheltered, kept him and trusted him. One afternoon he stood near the doorway while she stirred a pot and said, "I learned what it costs to be forgiven by being given a place to hide. I used to run. I don't want to run anymore." But his confession was plain and small, the kind that builds character one day at a time. Even the family who had been pushed from their land returned with seedlings tucked into the bottom of a crate. The father, his hands rough like Lindaura's late husband's, bent down and handed over a cluster of green stems, eyes fixed on the ground as if ashamed to ask for more than a patch of soil to call their own. The neighbors, remembering how Lindaura had once shared a small meal, came with more than words. Boards for a small storage shed, a hand pump that made drawing water less of a chore, seeds enough to plant a communal row. These were not fireworks, and they were not sudden wealth. They were slow, steady things, a crate of salt, a repaired fence, a neighbor who now borrowed a hoe and returned it sharpened. They were the kind of returns that do not fit in a ledger, but change the weight of days. Lindaura's pantry filled in time, not lavishly, but enough that when she spoke to visiting travelers, she could put out a plate that looked more like welcome than like desperation. And still, the question lingered like a hymn with a missing verse. Who had the stranger been? People asked each other in low tones as they washed plates or hauled water. Some shrugged and left it as mystery. Others felt the need to name the pattern. A travelling lay minister who stopped to speak with Marcello listened to the accounts and then sat a long while with his palms folded. He smelled of ink and old leather. He had seen many hearts confess and repair. "I have met people who say, 'The Lord walks in strange ways,'" he said finally. "But what matters is not that we put a single name to the face, but that we learn to keep our doors open when the road brings need." That answer satisfied nobody fully. It did not put the sighting to rest. Curiosity, like water, finds a way through soil. A pair of shepherd boys swore they had seen a man on the ridge 2 weeks after the main day, stopping to braid a child's hair and telling stories to make the child laugh. A woman on the hill said she had been given directions by a man who smelled faintly of smoke and wildflowers. She had never met him before. The stories multiplied into a pattern of presence. Here is someone who finds the lonely and stays a while. It was in one quiet late afternoon, months after the first cup of water, that the matter reached a hush. The house smelled of bread and herbs, the patched roof casting soft shadows. A group had gathered to mend a sack and split oats for a stew. No one was expecting anything out of the ordinary. Just the good labor of neighbors who had learned to be present. Lindaura sat near the table, her hands resting in her lap, when a soft footfall at the gate made everyone look up. The figure that entered was familiar, the stranger with dust still in the hems of his coat, though somehow the dust seemed less like a burden now and more like a traveling friend's mantle. He moved slowly, and he did not demand recognition. He sat at the edge of the room and watched hands that had learned to work together. The room grew quiet with a reverence that is not theatrical but lived. People who had once come as supplicants now sat as friends. The young man who had been sheltered rose with a bowl and set it before him without a word. Marcello stood and instinctively reached out, as if wanting to do something practical to honor this presence. When the stranger spoke, his voice was the same, gentle, quiet, as if it had always been tuned to the pulse of ordinary speech. "You have kept your hands ready," he said. "You have made space at your table, and that welcome has made places open in hearts beyond these walls." He looked from face to face, and when he looked at Lindaura, his gaze was steady, not demanding, but full of recognition. "Do you remember what you said when I came for a cup of water?" Lindaura's throat moved. She remembered the jaggery split into halves, the handful of flour, the way she had told him the simple truth. "I have nothing to offer, but I can help." The words felt like something she had sewn into the fabric of the house. "Yes," she said, her voice small. "I said it that day." He leaned forward just enough that the light fell on his face. There was no thunder and no trumpet. There was simply the kind of clarity that sometimes follows a long dusk. "You were speaking to me," he said. The sentence was plain. It held the texture of an old, honest disclosure. "You were talking to Jesus." For a moment, the room did not know how to breathe. Names had been tossed about for months: prophet, good man, a teacher of kindness. But here was a claim that exceeded gossip. Here was a gentle declaration that the stranger was the one whose presence the faithful had been taught to cherish. Lindaura's eyes filled, not with loud wonder, but with a calm that felt like river water pouring into a low bowl. It was not that she had always expected to meet the sacred in a stranger, but that now the pieces of the day, the ragged generosity, the returned neighbors, Marcello's tired face softened by belonging, collapsed into a single understanding. The hands that had given, the door left open, the long, patient prayer she had prayed each morning, they were not unnoticed. Marcello's knees went soft. He had come to the village with calloused hands and a guarded heart, but now the presence of the stranger, this revelation, moved him to his feet. He looked at his mother, as if seeing her anew. Neighbors who had watched from afar were near enough now that they could reach out and touch the outer edge of the revelation. A few crossed themselves, some lowered their heads, and others simply stared at the man who had walked into their lives and called himself the One, who offered hospitality to the lost. The stranger did not raise a sermon. He did not perform a miracle in the sense of sudden thunder or gold. He spoke quietly about the things that mattered, about eyes that see, about hands that give without keeping score, about the dignity given to those who come hungry, not only for bread, but for belonging. "I have been on the road," he said. "I walk where people sit at the edges, where doors are seldom opened. When you keep your gate unlocked, you give me a place to rest. When you share your bread, small as it may be, you feed more than hunger. You feed hope." Lindaura's face shone with tears that fell slow and humble. She had not been looking for a sign. She had been doing what she could, in the rhythm of mornings that required someone to start the day and keep the house moving. Now that simple life was recognized for what it had been, an offering. The recognition did not turn her poverty into riches in any ledger sense, but it did change how she understood the weight of her actions. The man lingered long enough to bless the hands that had reached out to him, Marcelo's strong palms, the trucker's grease-stained ones, the young man's hesitant fingers. He blessed, not with words of guarantee or statements that would serve as formulas, but with the kind of benediction that sets a heart on a steadier path. "Keep going," he said. "Love without counting cost. In the places where people are small, there is room for great mercy." Before he left that day, the stranger bowed his head to Lindaura and spoke softly, holding the room in the hush that follows intimate truth. "You said you had nothing," he said, "but in that nothing you made space for me. That is enough." He reached out and covered her hand with his for the briefest of moments, a touch that felt less like a charm and more like recognition, given freely. "Go on," he said. "Keep your door open." When he walked down the lane this time, the whole town watched until his shape became only a dark line against the field. The revelation remained, not a thunderclap, but a soft knowing that life had been touched. People came away from that afternoon with different kinds of work to do. Some mended their unwillingness to be neighbors. Others organized a rotation to carry water and tend to the house when Lindaura's bones felt weary. The trucker promised to bring supplies on every second trip. The family who had been expelled arranged with neighbors to help plant a larger bed of beans and sweet potatoes. Marcelo took seriously his pledge to stay, to plant steady rows, and to repair the fences by the creek. Months later, the house that had felt like the edge of the world took on the shape of a center. They built a small cistern together, not as a single act of charity, but as a communal project. Boards were measured, stones fitted, a ring of hands lifting and setting the final slab. The cistern never became miraculous in the way some stories claim water springs forth forever. What it did become was dependable enough to change the calculation of worry. Empty days came less often. Children learned to fish from the slow pool with patient joy. A small roof garden grew where children learned to water and wait. People ate together. They argued and forgiven and learned to live with each other in the steady way of neighbors whose lives have been intertwined long enough to know each other's griefs. In years that followed, the tale of the day the traveler sat by the stove circulated beyond the valley in measured ways. A sermon referenced it without claiming formulas. A visiting teacher said it was a lesson in humility. The story did not produce a stream of people seeking quick favors. Rather, it grew as a quiet encouragement to be the sort of person who will open the door when a stranger asks for a cup of water. There were small testimonies that could be told and were told, honest and plain. The trucker found his own way of being kinder. He paid for school books for a neighbor's child and noticed that his own impatience at the road's delays softened. The mother's son grew and married and brought his own children to learn herbal remedies and stories about a woman who gave him tea when he could not breathe. The young man who had once run made good on promises to remain and to teach the neighbor's boy how to mend nets. The family who had lost their land found employment in the patchwork gardens that the town now tended in common. None of this was the kind of abundant wealth that preaching brochures sometimes promise. No one's pockets suddenly bulged, and no mansion took the place of the clay walls. Instead, what multiplied was trust, the kind measured not in numbers, but in willingness to ask and readiness to help. Lindaura's life expanded not because money arrived, but because the people around her remembered how to be a people. And she, quiet, steady, continued her mornings. She woke before the sun and kept a small tin where neighbors could leave coins for others who might come hungry unexpectedly. She taught the children to knead dough slowly and to break jaggery into small pieces with care. When visitors came from towns farther away and asked who the stranger had been, Lindaura would usually shrug and answer in her low, even voice, "I do not know his name. I only know he asked for a cup and left me with more than a name." If pressed further, she would add, "I have said what I had to say. I have nothing to offer, but I can help." Some listeners left less satisfied. They wanted certainty, a neat package of proof. They were tempted to reduce grace to a sequence: give, and you will receive. But this community had learned a different thing, that acts of hospitality are not transactional. They are offerings in which both giver and receiver are changed. Sometimes nothing dramatic happens. Sometimes doors remain shut. That was part of the risk and part of the faith. Years later, children who had once peered through Lindaura's window now told the story not as a miracle checklist, but as a shape for living. When the road brings a stranger, consider your hands. When someone knocks, decide how you will answer. These were lessons taught at kitchen tables and in gardens, where beans curled up supports and where laughter rose like steam from a pot. The stranger's name, when people tried to pin it down, mattered less than the truth that had been revealed in the room that afternoon. The neighbor's welcome had been the same welcome one gives to the Lord. That claim was not a card to be played for personal gain, nor was it a proof that Christian life guarantees material change. Instead, it was a call. In the places where the world shrinks the least, where little is shared and hands touch, God meets us. Lindaura lived long enough to see small cycles. Marcello's children playing at the doorway, the cistern refilled by occasional rains and steady maintenance, neighbors who left and returned bearing gifts of work more than wealth. She spent afternoons teaching a little group how to make porridge that would not clump and how to mend a net. She often sat with the same phrase folded in her heart: "I have nothing to offer, but I can help." The phrase became a way of life, both definition and practice. Once, sitting beneath the tree where the stranger had stood months before, she listened to Marcello and a handful of others speak about the cost of returning to a life of mutual care. "It's inconvenient," Marcello admitted. "It takes time. It takes humility to ask for help or to accept it." A neighbor added, "But it gives you something that money can't buy. It gives you a place. It gives you people." The revelation that had altered their community did not end with one single pronouncement. Rather, it unspooled into daily choices. Who would visit a sick neighbor? Who would share a sack of corn when harvests failed? Who would bring a kettle when someone had no money to buy tea? In those choices, the stranger's quiet teaching, that God notices the way doors are kept, became less a slogan and more a practice. They learned to treat the least among them with the dignity of neighbors. There were nights when Lindaura would sit by the window and whisper a short prayer, simple and direct. "Lord," she would say, "keep my hands ready. Let me notice the lonely. Let me not count the cost before I count the need." The prayer was not an instrument by which she bargained for blessings. It was a posture. It asked not for reward, but for readiness. In the smallness of that prayer lived the heart of her life. On a bright morning, as she grew older, Marcello led a small company to the market and came back with news. A man in another town had told Marcello that he too had been stopped on the road by a traveller who seemed to have no name but left with the same small effect, people deciding to be kind. "He sits at other doors, ma'am," the man said, and the ripple goes on. Marcello smiled and lifted a basket of parsley, setting it on the table. "We are part of something bigger," he said, his voice soft. That was enough of a miracle for Lindaura. The idea that a tiny open door could have echoes. Years later, when she could not carry as much and hands trembled more readily, neighbours carried a lamp to the doorway for her each night and a pail of water in the mornings. She laughed when a child offered to sweep for her and accepted the help with old dignity. When the grandchildren ran in and out, their faces bright and unguarded, she felt the small, growing warmth of a life that had been given back. Then, on a late afternoon, when the light lay low and the air smelled of late lilies, visitors from a nearby village came carrying an old wooden bench. They had heard the story and wanted to make a gift that would last. They sat in a circle and told, in turns, what the day had come to mean for them. The trucker spoke of slowed haste. The mother of the boy who had once been feverish wiped her eyes and smiled. The young man who had stopped running told a story of a child he had helped pay for school. Each testimony layered into a living mosaic. Generosity begetting generosity, humility begetting courage. At the end of that gathering, when stories had been told and bread passed around, the conversation settled into a thoughtful silence. Lindaura, with hands that had once been quick and now slower, looked at the faces assembled, faces she had watched change, and spoke. "I did what a woman could," she said, and the sentence carried the modesty of years. "I had nothing, but I could help. If that helped someone see mercy, then I am content." Her words were not boastful. They were a statement of a life not wasted. The town did not become perfect. People still quarreled, still sometimes forgot. But they had learned to return to something simple, a table kept ready for the wayfarer. The house stood with its patched roof and its steady cistern, its garden of beans sending up green shoots every spring. Travellers still came, sometimes with needs, sometimes with stories. Lindaura's door remained unlatched most mornings, a small, steady invitation. Years on, when storytellers from nearby valleys came to ask for the tale of the woman who welcomed the stranger, they told it not as a formula, but as an encouragement. "She met Jesus," they would say plainly, "because she kept her door open." They did not mean to imply that every open door is a guarantee of meeting God in a recognizable form. They meant this: hospitality is the kind of act in which the sacred chooses to come near. For those who heard the story anew, the question remained: what will you do when the road brings someone in need? Will you, like Lindaura, make what you have into an offering? Will you, in the small arithmetic of daily life, count people as worth more than the coin you might keep in your palm? If this story has moved you, share it with someone who needs the reminder that hospitality is not the province of the wealthy, but of the willing. Choose one small act this week. Make room at a table, lend a coat, leave water for a thirsty passerby. Let the act be small enough to be honest and large enough to cost you something. And now a brief prayer. Lord, give us eyes to see the lonely, hands ready to help and hearts willing to open our doors. May we not wait for certainty to act, but offer what we have with faith. Amen. May the peace of the Lord be with you. May your door be open and your hands be ready. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that generosity matters.